Our great president, our beloved leaders, Emmanuel Macron, said that he wanted to make our country a startup nation. Okay, why not? But having entrepreneurs is one thing. Having entrepreneurs and customers is still something else. And very often you will need investors too. And that's one of the main problems. First, in France, money is not taboo anymore, but still a difficult subject. So if you want to get money from your friends, from your relatives, it can be very tricky. People may ditch you because you asked them maybe $500. Just a loan of $500. So that's the first point, especially if you are in a family with left-wing tendencies. Other problem, and that is maybe related, it's that French people have experienced through the ages, I would say since the 18th century, a few disappointing experiences with investment. First, there was the John Law system at the beginning of the 18th century. So it was the first time when somebody issued paper money on a large scale, and this crashed for the same reason that some European banks and American banks crashed during the crisis of the subprimes. It's that people had a lot of paper money, but there wasn't enough money in the vaults of the bank when they went to get solid coins back. So there was a lot of so-called scriptural money, but not enough solid money. People lost faith in the system, and many people lost their savings. Some say it was a good thing because people who lost their savings were rich people, and as a compensation, the French state wrote off its debts. So it was kind of redistribution. But it was not the only time when French people lost a lot of money. At the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, many French people purchased bonds issued by Imperial Russia, and a big part of the GDP ended up invested in Imperial Russian bonds. Problem is, Imperial Russia ceased to exist after the Bolshevik revolution. The revolution, yes, and the new regime defaulted on all the bonds. This was a big problem because not only people had invested a lot in these bonds, but also because they had done so because the newspapers had been bribed by Russian people so as to say that these bonds were extraordinary investments. Yeah, that reminds us a bit of the problems that arose in the 2008 crisis with bankers advising you to invest in their own financial products, and then when you lose your money, the bank said, "Oh, you signed; it's not a problem anymore." Result: big fines for banks. But at the beginning of the 20th century, it was difficult to do anything. So that's why French people may have problems with investment. And then let's forget about this. Let's suppose that you find standard investors, professional investors, business angels, for example, I don't know, big venture capital firms. These investors, even those who claim that they operate at seed stage, actually invest at a rather late stage. I mean, if you are a sole founder with no money, no connection, no traction, even the business angels will flee. And in France, and I guess it's the same in the United States because the criteria are the same, investors pay for traction. So if you don't have, say, a patent, connections, cash on your own, etc., you won't get traction, and you won't get investors. So a startup nation alone is pointless. It must be an entrepreneur plus customers plus investors nation. And I haven't seen anything done by the French government to allow this to happen. The only decision that was made was to sell for about 10 billion euros of French assets to fund startups, but that was just the initial idea. Now it has evolved, and not for the best. Now the French government plans to just keep this 10 billion euros in a fund, so it's about $11 billion, and just to deal out to startups the yearly profits of the fund. So these days it's difficult to make more than 3%. So with this $11 billion, with a good trader, maybe it will be possible to get 3% out of this $100 billion every year. So it means $330 million of investment for startups every year. But of course, these investments will be made late stage, and there's absolutely no guarantee that the best ideas are those which have reached the latest stages. That's one problem, and the other is the amount, $330 million. This is just peanuts, even on the French scale. It's a fraction of what French-based venture capital firms invest on a yearly basis. So the current plan for making France a startup nation is incomplete and not on the right track. Not at all. Now, another problem. Okay, so you want to start a business. You will get a lot of opinions when you tell people, hey, I have had this idea, what do you think about it? They will say, oh, that's cool, that's amazing, that's well, why not? But when you want to involve people, you will get almost nobody. I don't know if it happens only in France, but that's what happens here. So why does a politician like a president do this? He says we are going to make France a startup nation, and he doesn't seem to see all these problems. It's for a very simple reason. It's that information that go up the ladder from the people to the leaders is basically split into two categories: things that go very well and things that go very wrong. And for the rest, it's the administration that takes care of this. So Mr. Macron, who was the minister of economics before becoming president, he met all these startups, all these people who had reached the late stage and who were making millions, who were at least paper millionaires. And he said, that's great, okay. Of course, he knows about what goes wrong, but in the field of entrepreneurship, there's nothing really dramatic. I mean, it's not by starting your business that you will end up targeted by terrorists. So politicians have a completely biased view of what happens. They think that since there are people who succeed at building the company, many other people will succeed too. I've already explained why it was completely dubious. These days, people like Mr. Macron, who advocate the development of startups to help the economy grow, speak about ecosystems. Okay. So the idea is that if we put people together, like in the Silicon Valley, we replicate the Silicon Valley. Everybody in the world, they have the Silicon Valley, except of course if the country is too poor to have this kind of structure. I doubt very much that this could succeed. It's not because you have lots of people wanting to do something good for the economy that you will get any result, even if they talk to each other during the 1 year, etc. This ecosystem idea seems completely inefficient. Look at how the best known entrepreneurs of the world have succeeded. So let's start with Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was not rich. His parents were not rich. So he started his company, Apple company, Apple Incorporated, with $1,000. Well, $1,000 40 or 50 years ago were probably worth today's $3,000, maybe even more today. But he teamed up with a brilliant guy, Steve Wozniak, and they took part in a contest. Steve Wozniak did all the job because the contest was about some technical stuff, and Steve Jobs was not competent with the technical building. I mean, he understood the concepts behind the technique, but could not technically build anything without help. So Steve Wozniak did the job, and Steve Jobs said, okay, we have won $700, so we'll split it evenly, so you will get $350. But actually, the prize was $5,000. So they won it, and Steve Wozniak kept $350, and Steve Jobs took the rest, $4,650, which must be worth today much more than $10,000. So imagine that you would start your company today with $10,000. It's already not bad. Maybe in the US, since you can use a lot of credit cards to get this kind of amount. Don't forget that in France it's not really possible. People have one or two cards. They have the right to be overdrawn, but within certain boundaries, and you can't build up that much money with just your one or two credit cards. And even if you want to do that, you want to get what we call a consumption loan, you will need to prove that you have revenues. So, for example, the ninja loans of the subprime crisis didn't exist in France. It's just impossible. So if you are on the door, the bank will tell you, okay, the door cannot be seized. It's a revenue that is guaranteed to the holder. So if you default on the loan, we won't be able to get back our money. So the bank won't lend you this money, even if it's a consumption loan, even at a high rate. So that's really tricky. So Mr. Jobs, we didn't start with much, still started with something that is more or less equivalent to $10,000. That's better than many other people. Then there are other examples. So you have, for example, William Henry Gates III, known as Bill Gates. And Bill Gates, was the son of a businessman and a guy who probably already had millions. So he was not really a poor guy. He started with all the necessary assets. Then what do you have? Of course, you have Mark Zuckerberg, who started with a powerful network of connections, because Harvard is first and foremost a big network. Apart from that, of course, you have Ingvar Kamprad. Yes, this guy started with nothing. He is really an exception. But in France, for example, you have Mr. Pinault, and I've already heard stories about Pinault making money through subsidies. So he was the son of a man who managed sewing factories. Well, you know these factories when you get wood and you change the wood into paper or logs. And Mr. Pinault, the son, said to the state, "Okay, give me subsidies and I will develop the economy." So he pocketed the subsidies and it became rich that way. Actually, he didn't need the subsidies. Well, yes, he needed the subsidies to become richer, but he didn't need the subsidies to make a living. This is really an example of lack of ethics at work. And then you have Betancourt, who is the hero of a guy who started a big company. And in France, you have Bernard Arnault. And Bernard Arnault, he inherited a lot of things, I think, too. So nobody in France started with nothing. And you have even the example of Xavier Niel, who built his bankroll by designing kind of websites for pimps. So we don't really have anybody who started something big in France with nothing. So we could end this long list of people who already had everything from the start and who got still more during their journey. We have, of course, Google founders, Mr. Page and Mr. Brin, who got $150,000, I think, from Jeff Bezos, the guy who started Amazon and who is now the richest man in the world. At the time, Jeff Bezos was not that rich, but he was already a bit rich, at least enough to deal out 150 grand. So these two people, Mr. Page and Mr. Brain, they started with the means necessary to success. And Jeff Bezos himself started Amazon with money from his parents, and his parents gave him $300,000. Okay, so what I guess is that if you had a nation, whether it be French, German, or Peruvian, a nation in which every startup could start with 300 grand, I guess that this country would become very quickly an enormous startup nation. So what is happening actually? People who have everything from the start get another way to become still richer than they would have been if they had just had a day job. And you have the others who have one chance in 1,000 to succeed. I guess that Mr. Macron's claim was to give the possibility to everybody to succeed, but only people who already have enough to succeed will make the most of the features of the startup nations that our president is willing to build. And the others, as usual, we get nothing. That is called inequality.